Okay, hello everyone and welcome to the video. In this one we're going to be taking a look at the tax codes in MYOB. So anytime you process a transaction such as a spend money, banking, spend money, you can also do a shortcut to spend money by holding down the control button and hitting H. So control H goes directly to spend money. And if you want a shortcut to receive money, you can do the same by doing Control D. Alright, so here we are in spend money and you're processing a transaction. We got accounting fees, $100, and over here you got the tax code. So we can have a look. We got a whole bunch of choices here. What do they all mean? Alright, so we're going to go lists. Tax codes, and here we have that list as well, and this is where you can come in and make edits to the type of tax code it is and the rate of tax. Okay, so going down the list, there's quite a lot here, but for the most part what you're going to be using if you're registered for GST will be CAP, CAF occasionally, perhaps, FRE, and GST. Especially now under the simplified GST reporting, you won't even be using the CAP, CAF. You'll just be using GST, FRE, and NT for the most part. But for businesses that aren't using simplified GST reporting, they will still be using the expanded list as well as some larger businesses. So let's go down the list and see what they all do. Alright, the first one, ABN, no ABN withholding. This is for when a supplier presents you with an invoice for their services, but they do not have an ABN. Now, when you do not have an ABN as a supplier, you're supposed to fill out a thing called the Statement by a Supplier form. And it's commonly referred to as a hobby form. These are pretty much people who are running a hobby and not really a serious business, so that's why I don't have an ABN. Now, if they don't provide you with a statement by supplier form or a hobby form, and they don't have an ABN, what you're supposed to do is use this tax code here, ABN, and then you withhold quite a high amount, and then they can probably get that back in their tax return, but that's what the ATO likes you to do. Now, if you're buying a capital asset, and this is usually something that's over $1,000, it might be a motor vehicle, it might be a piece of machinery, it might be a computer. So it's not a general expense, it's a fixed asset that usually lasts for a number of years that you will depreciate over a number of years, unless you depreciate it fully on purpose, per the tax rules. But for the sake of accounting, it is a fixed asset. Now, that's what CAP is, capital acquisitions. So a fixed asset where there's GST on it, so there's 10%. Same thing is if you're buying a second-hand car off a private seller and there's no GST on it, then that would be capital but GST free, so you can use CAF. And you can call these codes whatever you want them to be. So if you want to change CAF here, you can change it here. Moving on down, a GST-free export. So this is for when you are exporting services to overseas where there is no GST on it. So instead of having GST on your invoice, you would have EXP. GST-free. Now, this is used mostly for purchases. It can be used for sales as well. But the example we'll use here is for purchases if it is an item that does not have GST attached to it. So if you're going to the supermarket and you bought some milk for your coffee room and you're deducting that on your books as a staff amenity, for example, then milk does not have GST. So the coding for that would be FRE, 0% tax on that. GNR is used for a supplier that is not registered for GST. So they have an ABN, but they're not registered for GST. So you can use GNR there. A lot of people will also use FRE. They've got an ABN. There's no GST on it because they're not registered for GST, so there's no 0% GST there. So the end result in your BAS is exactly the same. for those two. GST will be your most common one, so all of your sales will have GST on it if you're registered, of course, and all your purchases that are GST applicable will also have GST at the rate of 10%. GW, consolidated WEG and WET. Now this is all about the wine equalization tax. So if you're in the wine industry, there is a 12.9% wine equalization tax. And you can see here you got the WEG, the WET, and GW for the consolidated WEG and WET. So you got the WET, the wine equalization tax, and the WEG is the GST on top of the wine equalization tax. That's a bit confusing. For most people, you won't use these at all. These are just for businesses that operate within the wine industry, like vineyards, wineries, and maybe some breweries and things like that. INP. This is input taxed, and this generally relates to interest. So if you pay interest or you receive interest, there's no GST on that. You can see here 0%, and that would be INP, input taxed. The luxury car tax. Most people won't use this. This is for businesses that sell or import luxury cars, like dealers, as well as individuals who import luxury cars. It's at a rate of 33%, and it comes into play for vehicles that are over about 70,000, 80,000, depending on what kind of vehicle it is. Most people won't use this. And NT. So if you are registered for GST, you'll be using NT for things like depreciation, things like wages, items that are not part of the GST tax system, basically. You'll also use it sometimes for transferring to a bank account. So if you're doing like a spend money and you're transferring to a bank account, like so, from business bank account number 1 to business bank account number 2, that'll go through as an NT, because a transfer between two accounts, your accounts, internal bank accounts, is not part of the tax system. If you're not registered for GST, then basically none of this will apply. You'll never use your GST, FRE and all that kind of thing. If you're not registered for GST, basically everything will go through as NT, not reportable, because you're not part of the GST system because you're not registered for GST. You may still have to withhold ABN here if you're going to do that, but pretty much all the other tax codes will just go through as NT. And then if you did register for GST, then you would start using your GST, your FRE, your CAP, and so forth. So if we go have a look at the accounts list now, I'm going to close out of here. This shows all of the accounts in the general ledger, and we can see the default tax codes here. And you can see here all the bank accounts are NT. You got some clearing accounts, NT, not reportable, no GST on that. System accounts like debtors and inventory, no GST, NT. And then we get down into the non-current assets. You can see furniture costs, CAP, that's a capital asset, 10% GST. Accumulated depreciation is NT. Into the liabilities, all of the loan accounts, credit cards, that kind of thing, NT, no GST. The GST collected, GST paid, they're NT because they're basically system accounts where this tracks the accumulated GST on sales, GST collected, and GST paid is the accumulated amount of GST on purchases. So the tax code for the account is NT, but when you code something GST, it goes into these accounts here. Small loans, equity, it's all NT. When you get into the P&L accounts, so the income and the expenses, this is where you start to use the GST coding more. So you got your income, it's all GST. If you had interest here, that would probably be INP. Actually, I think it's down here somewhere. Well, maybe, oh, here we go, other income. You got interest, INP. And you can see the normal expenses, most of it's GST. Bank fees is FRE because there's no GST on bank fees. Borrowing expenses, that's FRE. Just about everything else has GST. Council rates are GST free. Water is GST free. Some things you have to be a little bit careful with. For example, like I was saying before, if you go to the supermarket and it all goes under the catering account, and if you had a catering account here, it might well be defaulted as GST. But you have to be careful. Look at your invoice, or your receipt rather, and see what doesn't have GST, because your milk won't have GST, a lot of your fresh produce won't have GST, but then a lot of stuff that's been processed, like a packet of chips, for instance, will have GST. NT for wages and salaries, not part of the GST system. And depreciation is all NT. No GST on tax paid. Interest, that could go in as FRE or INP. The result will be the same as long as your settings have it set up as 0%. So these are all your default settings. Just because something is set up as a default doesn't mean it's always going to be correct. So whenever you process a transaction, we'll go back to that. We'll use the shortcut, Control H to spend money. And you go 6. We'll just pick any account. And you can see here that it's defaulted to GST. It might not well be GST. If it isn't GST, you'll have to adjust it accordingly, either by changing it here and splitting out the line item, or changing it down here. Anyway guys, that's it for the video. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments below. We'll do what we can to help. If you want to book in a training session, head over to the link in the description. Head over to our website and fill out a contact form entry there. Other than that, hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you in the next one.